The memo was still warm. That was the first thing Marcus noticed. Not the smell of bleach that had permanently embedded itself into his knuckles. Not the hum of fluorescent lights that never, ever turned off in the 42nd floor of Hartwell Capital Group. Not the distant sound of a man raging behind a door that cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. No. It was the warmth of the paper. Like the man who had crumpled it had done so in anger, fast, furious, hands still hot from the fight. Marcus Osei pushed his mop bucket down the corridor with the same slow, invisible shuffle he had perfected over 4 years of being overlooked. He wore a faded blue uniform that smelled of industrial detergent and old regret. His head was down. It was always down. That was the trick. You had to make yourself so small, so invisible, so utterly beneath notice, that powerful men forgot you existed even while you stood 3 feet away from them. He stopped outside the CEO's office. The shouting had gone quiet now. He pushed open the service door with his shoulder, pulling the mop bucket in behind him. The office was a crime scene of controlled luxury, a shattered crystal tumbler near the fireplace, a spray of amber liquid across the marble floor, a crumpled sheet of paper near the Italian leather trash bin that clearly hadn't made it in. Marcus began to clean. He always began to clean. But as he crouched to pick up the crumpled memo, his eyes that had read 3 degrees worth of financial textbooks before circumstances stole that life from him, those eyes caught the numbers. $5 million. Cayman Islands. Shell account, Ridgemont Consulting LLC. Transfer authorized, R. Hartwell, CEO. He read it twice. Then a third time. He felt something shift in his chest, not fear, not exactly. Something older than fear. Something that had been sleeping for 4 years. He folded the memo into a perfect square and slid it into the front pocket of his uniform, beneath his ID badge. Then he kept mopping. He was still mopping when the associate director, a narrow man named David Pruitt, came strutting down the corridor with 2 junior analysts scrambling to keep pace. Pruitt had the particular walk of a man who had never once questioned whether he deserved to be in the room. Q3 bonuses hit Friday, gentlemen, Pruitt announced without looking at either of them. My 4th home is finally getting that wine cellar. He laughed at his own joke. The analysts laughed too, but their eyes were dead. Marcus was invisible. As always. But then Pruitt paused by the CEO's office door and frowned. His eyes swept the room, the shattered glass, Marcus on his knees on the marble, and landed briefly on the trash bin. Marcus tracked his gaze. A yellow receipt, barely visible at the top of the bin, had escaped the crumple. He could see the letterhead from here, Casa Fleur, 5th Avenue. The charge, $5,000. The name, E. Reyes. Pruitt snatched the receipt, glanced at it, and pocketed it with a thin smile that told Marcus everything he needed to know. He was collecting insurance, too. And then it happened. Pruitt turned to leave and his elbow caught the edge of the mounted photo frame on the wall, a glossy trophy shot of Hartwell and Pruitt at the Davos Forum, and it fell, shattering against the doorframe with a crack like a gunshot. Pruitt spun around, eyes wide, looking directly at Marcus. Marcus looked up. Just a janitor. Just a face. Blank. Unthreatening. Clean that up, Pruitt said. Then he left. Marcus watched him go. And then, alone in the ruins of powerful men's secrets, he allowed himself the smallest, most dangerous of smiles. He had been patient for 4 years. He would not be patient much longer. The penthouse was on the top floor of a building that didn't appear in any tourist guide to Manhattan. You had to know someone to know it existed, and you had to be someone for that knowledge to matter. Marcus had bought it 11 years ago, before the collapse of his own company, a collapse that was not an accident, a collapse that had been engineered by a man named Robert Hartwell, who had stolen Marcus's proprietary algorithm, repackaged it under a different IP filing, and then used it to build Hartwell Capital Group into a $4.2 billion enterprise while Marcus Osei filed for bankruptcy and spent 2 years unable to find work in any firm that the old man's reach extended to. Which was all of them. The janitor position at Hartwell Capital Group had not been a fall from grace. It had been a calculated insertion. Marcus stood in his penthouse bathroom and peeled off the blue uniform. He stood under the shower for exactly 4 minutes, cold, then scalding, and emerged a different man. He opened the walk-in wardrobe and considered his options with the detached precision of a general dressing for war. He chose a charcoal Brioni suit, a Turnbull and Asser shirt the color of fresh cream, and a Patek Philippe Nautilus that had once been the first thing he'd ever bought when the algorithm started printing money. He looked at himself in the mirror. The janitor was gone. Someone else looked back. His phone chimed. A custom alert from the location tracker he'd placed, with considerable effort and not a small amount of irony, in the lining of Pruitt's company-issued briefcase 3 weeks ago. David Pruitt was at Silencio. Marcus straightened his cufflinks. "Let's have a conversation," he said quietly to his reflection. Silencio was not a place that advertised itself. It existed in a converted brownstone in Tribeca whose only exterior indication of its nature was a small, brushed steel panel beside an unmarked door. The kind of place where deals were discussed over bottles that cost more than a teacher's monthly salary, and where the music was low enough that secrets felt safe. Marcus arrived at 11:17 p.m. and was admitted without a word. He moved through the dim, expensive air toward the bar and found Pruitt exactly where the tracker said he'd be, in a curved leather booth near the back, already loud, already loose, a woman beside him who was not his wife laughing at something that wasn't funny. Marcus took a barstool that gave him sightline to the booth. He ordered a Macallan 25, neat, and settled into the practiced stillness of a man who knows how to wait. It took 11 minutes for the collision to occur. Pruitt stood to make his way to the bar and stumbled, genuinely stumbled, the graceless lurch of a man 4 drinks past his limit, directly into Marcus. The Macallan went across the front of Marcus's suit. "Watch where you're," Pruitt started, then looked up. And stopped. Something crossed his face. A flicker. The brain's desperate attempt to connect two things that didn't belong in the same universe. The cheekbones. The jaw. The particular stillness of the eyes. I'm sorry, Pruitt blinked. "Do I know you?" Marcus smiled. It was a different smile to the one in the CEO's office. This one was warm, patrician, the smile of a man who is entirely comfortable being looked at. He tilted his chin up precisely 12 degrees, he'd practiced this, and allowed the faintest trace of an English accent, borrowed from 4 years at the London School of Economics, to coat his words like lacquer. "I very much doubt it," Marcus said pleasantly. "Though I'm told I have one of those faces. James Whitmore Bell. Dreadful bore of an evening to have something spilled on you. Please, let me replace that drink." Pruitt's suspicion deflated like a punctured tire. Wealth was its own passport. The suit, the watch, the accent, the ease, these were a language Pruitt's entire identity was built on recognizing, and what he recognized was someone above him. His shoulders dropped. "David Pruitt," he said, extending his hand. "Associate Director at Hartwell Capital." "Ah. Finance," Marcus said, as though the word was mildly interesting the way weather was mildly interesting. "Drinks then." It was Pruitt's companion, a sharp-eyed woman named Lena, who first noticed the watch. Her gaze moved to it the way a falcon's gaze moves to movement in grass, fast, involuntary, professional. "That's a Nautilus," she said quietly. 5726, first generation. Marcus turned to her with measured appreciation. "You have a good eye." Pruitt looked between them with the particular discomfort of a man who has just realized he is the least interesting person in his own conversation. If you're watching this and thinking, "Wait, this is insane, how is this real?" subscribe right now and stay with us, because this story gets so much darker before it gets light. The next morning, the blue uniform was back on. Marcus pushed his mop bucket past Pruitt's office at 8:14 a.m. Pruitt was already inside, door half open, and Marcus could hear him on the phone, the clipped, strained voice of a man who had slept poorly and woken up more paranoid than he'd gone to bed. "I'm telling you, there was something off about him. I can't explain it. Just run the name, Whitmore Bell, English, maybe mid-40s, look, just, a pause. Never mind. Never mind. Did the sweep team check the 4th-floor telecom closet?" Marcus slowed imperceptibly. Kept moving. 10 minutes later, Pruitt emerged from his office and spotted Marcus rounding the corner with the mop. "Hey. You." Marcus turned with the practiced blankness of a man whose name no one in this building had ever used correctly. "Yes, sir." Pruitt studied him with bloodshot eyes. Something working behind them. Some itch he couldn't scratch. Have you been in the executive suite this week? Yes, sir. Monday morning. Spill near Mr. Hartwell's office. Did you touch anything? Go through anything? No, sir. Just mopped. Marcus met his eyes. Held them. Completely empty. Just mopped. Pruitt stared another moment, then his gaze moved on the way powerful men's gazes always moved on, past the object that didn't register as a threat, and he walked away. As he turned the corner, Marcus raised his phone and took a clean, crisp photo of the collar of Pruitt's dress shirt. Just visible above the fold, a half-moon of burgundy lipstick. Lena's shade, unmistakably. File saved. The telecom closet on the 38th floor was accessed by a key that maintenance staff were issued and that no one in executive management had ever once thought to reclaim. It was full of cable runs and server junction boxes and the specific smell of heat and copper wire, and it shared a ventilation duct with the executive conference room 2 floors above. Marcus worked quickly and without light, fitting a relay receiver behind the tertiary junction panel in a space smaller than a paperback book. He'd sourced the equipment through a shell company 3 months ago. He'd rehearsed this installation in his apartment 47 times. He was back in the corridor in 8 minutes, mop bucket in hand. 22 minutes later, the audio came through his earpiece as he cleaned the stairwell 1 floor below. It was Hartwell's voice. Robert Hartwell, the CEO. A voice Marcus had heard for 4 years as muffled authority behind closed doors, and which he now heard clearly for the first time. It was harder than he'd expected. Colder. The Cayman account needs to be dark by end of month. All of them. I want the consulting structures dissolved. A pause. Because someone's been talking, Gerald. I don't know who yet. But when I find out, another pause, longer. Just do it. Burn the shells. Marcus stood very still in the stairwell, mop in hand, listening to the man who had stolen everything from him beginning to cover his tracks. 7 days, he calculated. That was how long he had. The CEO's wife arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor Hartwell was a precise, elegant woman in her early 60s who wore her wealth with less desperation than her husband, which Marcus had always thought was the only genuinely admirable thing about the family. She came to deliver flowers for the boardroom display, an act of charitable domestic maintenance that she performed monthly without acknowledgement. Marcus was cleaning the executive foyer when she arrived. He held the door. She walked through without looking at him, which was standard. But as she passed, he noticed her pause, just barely, near the reception desk, where a second floral delivery receipt sat in the outgoing mail tray. The name on the floral order from Casa Fleur, Valentina E. Reyes. The amount, $5,000. The authorization signature, unmistakably Robert Hartwell's. Eleanor Hartwell's jaw moved slightly. Her chin lifted a precise degree. She set her own flowers down on the counter and walked to her husband's office without knocking. The shouting that followed lasted 6 minutes. Marcus mopped calmly through all of it. Casa Cipriani occupied the top floor of the old Cipriani Club building on Wall Street, and the $10,000 plate charity dinner that Thursday night was for a foundation whose name Marcus had not bothered to remember because the only name that mattered was the one on the guest list, Robert Hartwell, table 6. James Whitmore Bell arrived at 8:45 p.m. He was placed, through a call from a private concierge service that had cost Marcus $3,000 6 weeks ago, at a table adjacent to table 6. He found the CEO at the bar before the seating. Hartwell was a large man who had once been athletic and was now simply large, broad shoulders carrying more weight than they had in photographs from a decade ago, a jaw set in the permanent expression of a man who expects to be obeyed. He held his scotch with both hands around the glass, the way men hold things when they're holding on. Marcus placed himself beside him at the bar. The bartender appeared immediately. This was what the suit and the watch did, it was its own magic. Hartwell glanced sideways. The glance extended slightly longer than a stranger warranted. Something passed behind his eyes. The same thing that had passed behind Pruitt's. James Whitmore Bell, Marcus said, extending his hand. Foundry Capital, London. Hartwell shook it automatically, the way men of his class shook hands, a reflex before evaluation. Robert Hartwell. I know who you are, Marcus said. Not reverential. Just factual. The way you'd acknowledge a mountain. Something in Hartwell's posture adjusted almost imperceptibly, the subtle inflation of a man who has been correctly identified. Foundry Capital. I'm not familiar. We prefer it that way. A slight smile. Obscurity is a competitive advantage in our business, Mr. Hartwell. Hartwell studied him. The cheekbones again. The jaw. Marcus watched him searching his memory for a reference point that did not exist. You remind me of, Hartwell started. Everyone says that, Marcus said warmly. I'm told I have a common face. He raised his glass. Shall we? At dinner, Marcus deployed the interrogation with the patience of a surgeon. He raised hypotheticals about offshore structuring, purely academic, of course, a paper he was reviewing, a regulatory question, and watched Hartwell's face move through comfort and then discomfort and then the careful blankness of a man who suspects a trap but cannot locate the spring. The question, Marcus said, swirling his wine, is at what point hypothetical corporate malfeasance becomes a question of character rather than of law. Would you agree that the law is an inadequate moral framework for men of our reach? Hartwell looked at him for a long moment. I think, he said carefully, that this is a conversation better suited to a different venue. Of course, Marcus said pleasantly. Hartwell's phone buzzed under the table. His eyes dropped to it. Marcus watched his face drain. Excuse me, Hartwell said, and was on his feet and moving for the exit before Marcus could respond. Marcus stayed and finished his wine. He was not concerned. He had planted what he needed to plant. The seed was in. What he didn't know, not yet, was that upstairs, back at the bank, the text Hartwell had received was ordering a full security sweep. And the sweep teams were already pulling lockers. The guards reached his locker at 11:03 p.m. Marcus knew because his phone, still in his tuxedo pocket in the men's room at Cipriani, showed the alarm on the motion sensor he'd placed inside the locker door. He was in a car, 11 blocks away, and he was already doing math. He'd left nothing identifiable in the locker. The receiver was in the mop bucket. The mop bucket was in the maintenance storage bay on the 38th floor, behind 3 other mop buckets, in the corner that the sweep team's manifest listed as non-priority zone. He knew this because he had written the maintenance floor map that the security team used for their sweeps, 18 months ago, when a well-placed favor to the facilities manager had earned him that particular job. He was back in his uniform and in the building by 11:47 p.m., calm the way only a man who has planned for exactly this can be calm. The guards were still on the floor. And then Hartwell did something Marcus hadn't planned for. He called in an external corporate espionage sweep team. Men in gray suits who moved differently than security guards, who looked at baseboards and ceiling junctions and ventilation grates with the patient eyes of people who had done this before. Marcus had 40 minutes, maybe less. He moved to the maintenance cart and found the industrial bleach. He poured a precise amount, not enough to be dangerous, enough to be urgent, along the corridor junction near the server room, then activated the chemical spill protocol on the floor intercom, which automatically diverted the sweep team to the far stairwell. In the commotion, he lifted the fingerprint he'd been cultivating for 3 weeks, a clean index print from a glass in the executive pantry, lifted with a commercial gel and mounted to a thumb-shaped silicone transfer, pressed it to the biometric reader on the server room door, and was inside in 11 seconds. The routing numbers were in the transfer log archive. He'd been watching the system long enough to know where they lived. He photographed them with his phone, for shell accounts, 2 in Cayman, 1 in BVI, 1 in Liechtenstein, and he was reaching for the door when the handle moved from the other side. Pruitt. Marcus dropped. Not ran, dropped. Down to his knees in the shadow between the server rack and the wall, scrubbing brush out of the uniform pocket, head down, invisible. 19 years of conditioning told his body what to do before his mind could intervene. Pruitt walked in. He moved toward the terminal, muttering to himself, if Hartwell thinks I'm taking the fall for this, he's out of his mind, absolutely out of, and stopped at the station. Typing. Pulling something up. Marcus did not breathe. Pruitt reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a pen to write something, and the pen slipped, rolled across the floor, came to a stop 3 inches from Marcus's knee. A pause. Pruitt looked toward the floor. Marcus kept scrubbing. Head down. Blue uniform. Invisible. Pruitt picked up the pen, his fingers 3 inches from Marcus's hand, and straightened. He looked at his phone. Then he left. Marcus stayed on the floor for 20 seconds after the door closed. Then he stood up, and as he did, he saw the screen Pruitt had left open on the terminal. A transfer order. $150 million. Authorized for 7 days hence. Not $5 million. Not a shell company maintenance payment. $150 million, and it was leaving the building in a week. He photographed the screen. Then he left. And his hands, trained to be steady, were not entirely steady. The next morning, an anonymous package arrived at the Hartwell residence in Greenwich. It contained a printed copy of the Casa Fleur receipt for $5,000, addressed to Valentina E. Reyes. Below it, printed in clean 12-point font, was a single line. Ask him about Ridgemont Consulting. Eleanor Hartwell's call to the family lawyer lasted 47 minutes. Her call to Robert Hartwell lasted 3. The call between Hartwell and Pruitt afterward lasted 11, and even through the relay receiver, now relocated to a safe position, the content was clear enough. You told her. Hartwell's voice. Ice and gravel. I didn't, Robert, I swear to God I didn't. The receipt was in the office trash, David. You were the only one who. I didn't touch it. I saw it, I didn't, a fractured pause. You were supposed to, look, that's not the point is someone else is in this building who knows about. You're done, Hartwell said. You're out of the deal. Effective immediately. Robert. Robert, wait. The line went dead. Marcus set down the receiver and allowed himself 30 seconds of something that felt close to satisfaction. Then he went back to work. If you're still here, and if you are, you already know this story is different. Hit subscribe before the next part, because what happens at Zero Bond is the moment everything changes. Zero Bond was the kind of members-only club that existed exclusively to remind its members how exclusive it was. Dark wood, leather, the particular silence of a room full of people who never raised their voices because they'd never needed to. It was where Hartwell brought the man from the Liechtenstein account, a gray man named Gerhardt, to finalize the transfer details. Marcus had known this meeting was coming because the relay receiver had caught the scheduling call 4 days ago. He had spent those 4 days engineering a reason to be present. He arrived as James Whitmore Bell at 9 p.m., 15 minutes before Hartwell. He made friends with the sommelier, a slow, careful cultivation that had begun 2 weeks ago and had cost him $400 in tips, and arranged for a particular bottle of Barolo to be sent to Table 9 as a gift from an anonymous admirer of Robert Hartwell's foundation work. The bottle arrived before Hartwell did. Marcus watched from across the room as Hartwell settled in, examined the bottle with the reflexive pleasure of a man who is given things by admirers, and pulled the cork. Inside the cork, nestled in a cavity machined with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, was a directional microphone the size of a grain of rice. Marcus ordered his dinner, settled into his chair, and listened through his earpiece as 2 men 20 feet away discussed the decryption key for a $150 million transfer. Gerhardt was methodical, almost bored. Hartwell was tight, impatient. The key, it emerged, was not digital. It was physical, a sequence on a card kept in a mechanical safe in Hartwell's private executive office. A Keller and Muller, Series 4, 1987. 8-digit combination. Marcus ate his branzino. He was no longer hungry, but he ate it anyway, because leaving early would have been irregular. He pulled the fire alarm at 2:14 a.m. Not the building alarm, that would have triggered a full emergency response and locked down executive floors. He pulled the suppressed alarm in the executive suite's kitchen alcove, which triggered the localized evacuation of floors 40 through 42 and notified the building's internal security team, giving him an estimated 12-minute window before a physical sweep was conducted. He was through the executive suite door in 90 seconds. He had the stethoscope, a modified Littmann with an amplified acoustic pad, out of his maintenance bag and against the Keller and Muller's dial in under 2 minutes. The safe was a 1987 model and its internal tolerances had widened with age. A younger safe would have taken an expert 20 minutes. This one took Marcus 7, listening for the click of each disc dropping into alignment with the focus of a man who has had 4 years to practice silence. The card was inside. He photographed it. He relocked the safe. He was back in the stairwell in 11 minutes total. 14 seconds later, Hartwell's private elevator hummed to life. Marcus was behind the server rack alcove in the corridor, utterly still, as Hartwell emerged from the elevator and walked directly into his office. 38 seconds of silence. Then the sound of the safe being opened, the card being checked. Marcus could picture the relief on the man's face, and then relocked. Hartwell left without turning on a single light, which told Marcus that he'd wanted no witnesses even to himself. The moment the elevator closed, Marcus moved to a terminal in the adjacent analyst bay. He had the routing numbers, the shell account structure, the decryption key, and, through a connection he'd spent 14 months building at the Federal Reserve's Fraud Division, access to a federal escrow mechanism that existed precisely for moments like this one. The rerouting took 4 minutes and 31 seconds. $150 million began moving from 4 offshore accounts to a federal escrow flagged under case number FR 2024-09914. Marcus logged out, wiped the session, replaced the terminal screensaver, and was in the stairwell with his mop bucket before the building's security cycle refreshed. He had done it. And then his phone buzzed. An alert from a secondary monitoring program he'd installed on the network, Hartwell's terminal, 2:41 a.m. An access attempt on the transfer queue. The discovery was faster than he'd estimated. By 6 a.m., the executive suite was occupied by 4 men from a private cyber forensics firm. By 8 a.m., Hartwell had called the FBI, framing the maintenance department, specifically citing the overnight cleaning crew, for an unauthorized server access event. By 9 a.m., 2 FBI field agents were in the building's lobby. Marcus, in his blue uniform, was in the 38th floor stairwell behind the fire door. He was looking at the uniform, really looking at it. The ID badge with the wrong name. The faded blue fabric that smelled of bleach and 4 years of performance. The shoes with the smooth soles for miles of marble floor. He walked to the loading dock. He found a steel maintenance barrel. He struck a match. The uniform burned slowly. Then faster. He stood and watched until there was nothing left but ash. Then he walked to his car, not his personal vehicle, the one registered to James Whitmore Bell's LLC, and he drove to his penthouse and he put on his best suit. Tonight was the Hartwell Foundation's annual philanthropic gala. Black tie. Invitation only. He had received his invitation 3 months ago, under the name Whitmore Bell. The foundation had been delighted to have him as a donor. The ballroom of the St. Regis was full of exactly the kind of people who had never once considered what it might feel like to be invisible. Crystal chandeliers. String quartet. The particular laughter of people who have always felt safe. Marcus arrived at 8:30 p.m. He moved through the room with the ease of a man arriving home, accepting a glass of champagne, nodding at the right faces, invisible in an entirely different way now, the invisibility of perfect belonging. He found Hartwell near the podium at 9:04 p.m. The CEO was mid-conversation with 2 board members, his face carrying the particular strain of a man managing a crisis while pretending not to be managing a crisis. His color was off. His collar was too tight. Marcus placed himself beside him. Waited. Hartwell turned. The recognition came in stages, the way bad news always comes in stages. The face first, familiar, not placeable. Then the name clicking, Whitmore Bell. Then the slow wrongness spreading from that familiarity, because something about this man in this room, tonight of all nights, was wrong. Marcus leaned in slightly, close enough to be private. He dropped his voice to barely above a whisper. Your accounts are empty, Robert. Hartwell's face went through 5 expressions in 3 seconds. Confusion. Denial. Realization. Rage. Fear. What did you? He grabbed Marcus's arm. Who are you? Someone you stepped on, Marcus said. Calm. Almost gentle. Hartwell's grip tightened. His voice dropped to a hiss. Get him out, he said to the nearest security guard. Get him out of here, he's an imposter. Marcus smiled. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a slim black card, matte, embossed with a single emblem, the kind of card that existed in only 11 wallets on the planet. The card of the holding company that owned, through 4 layers of legitimate acquisition, 14% of Hartwell Capital Group. I think you'll find I'm rather authorized to be here. The security guard looked at the card. Then at Hartwell. Then stepped back. The room had begun to notice. You're watching history happen right now. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss a single second of how this ends. What followed was the kind of scene that the people in that ballroom would describe for the rest of their professional lives. Marcus walked to the podium. He took the microphone from the foundation's executive director with a quiet, "Forgive me," and faced the room. The string quartet tapered off. He spoke for exactly 3 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He simply told the room who he was, Marcus Osei, formerly of Osei Analytics, whose proprietary risk modeling algorithm had been stolen and repackaged by Robert Hartwell in 2019 to form the intellectual foundation of Hartwell Capital Group's principal trading strategy. He noted that he was now the majority beneficial owner of the holding company that held the largest single stake in this firm. He noted that the SEC filing was on record. He noted that FBI agents were currently in the building. He did not mention the $150 million. From the back of the room, Hartwell's voice cut through the silence, strangled, furious, the voice of a man watching the walls come down. That man is a fraud. He is an imposter. He is the fugitive janitor who broke into our server room. I want him arrested right now. The room turned. 2 men in dark suits who had been standing near the service entrance moved forward. Marcus waited. The men walked past him. They walked to Robert Hartwell. One of them produced a badge, FBI, Economic Crimes Division, and said, in a voice that carried all the way to the podium, "Mr. Hartwell, we'd like you to come with us." The second agent moved through the crowd and placed a hand on David Pruitt's shoulder. The room exhaled. Marcus descended from the podium. He walked through the crowd, through the stunned, calculating, recalibrating faces of people who were doing exactly what powerful people do when power shifts, deciding which side they were on now. He walked to where the handcuffs were going on. Hartwell was rigid with fury, his face the color of old brick. He turned to Marcus as the agent read his rights, and his eyes were everything Marcus had needed to see, the recognition, complete and irreversible, of a man who finally understood what had been done to him, and by whom, and from how close. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket. He produced a square of faded blue fabric, a remnant from the uniform, the breast pocket portion with the maintenance department logo, and with precise, deliberate care, he reached out and wiped a speck of imaginary dust from the shoulder of Hartwell's tuxedo. He leaned in. He dropped his voice. He let the accent go entirely, for the first time in 4 years, and spoke in his own voice, his actual voice, the one from Lagos and London and a lower Manhattan office that no longer existed. "You put a wet floor sign in front of my building the day you stole my company," Marcus said. "You didn't even see it. You just walked right through." A pause. Just a half breath. "That was disrespectful, Robert." Hartwell stared at him. And Marcus watched the horror arrive, the full, architectural horror of it, as the CEO understood that the man who had mopped his floors for 4 years, who had held the service door, who had been invisible while he raged and schemed and stole, had been watching every single thing. "You," Hartwell's voice broke. It actually broke. "You were cleaning up after you," Marcus said. "Yes." The agents moved Hartwell toward the exit. By morning, the board had been convened by emergency proxy. Marcus, as the beneficial majority holder, exercised his right to initiate governance review. 3 board members who had signed off on the fraudulent consulting receipts were removed. The remaining board voted, in a session that lasted 41 minutes, to place the firm under independent administrative control pending SEC review. Marcus stood in the executive suite, Hartwell's office, with its Italian marble and its replacement picture frames, and addressed the full staff on a company-wide call. He spoke for 6 minutes. He announced that the forensic accounting process had identified $22 million in manipulated bonus suppressions from the previous 4 fiscal years, and that this amount would be distributed immediately to the staff levels from which it had been withheld: analysts, administrators, facilities management, and operations support. The facilities management team. The people who cleaned up after everybody else. He ended the call. He stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the city that had watched him fall and had not noticed. 6 months later, Robert Hartwell was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison on wire fraud, securities fraud, and intellectual property theft charges. David Pruitt received 4 years and a lifetime bar from the financial industry. The news coverage was extensive. The anchor on the financial network noted with interest that while the $150 million in offshore funds had been flagged and seized by federal authorities pending repatriation, a small but significant discrepancy existed in the escrow accounting. $8.3 million appeared to have been redirected through a secondary transfer channel in the final moments of the rerouting sequence, to an account whose beneficial owner the Federal Reserve's forensic team had been unable to identify. The anchor found this curious. The prosecutor found it frustrating. The FBI's Economic Crimes Division opened a secondary inquiry. No one asked the man in the penthouse. Marcus Osei, not James Whitmore Bell, not the janitor with the mop and the blank face, but Marcus Osei, himself, original and entire, sat in his penthouse at 11:58 p.m. and looked out at the city. He was in a white shirt, no jacket, no tie, the way he'd sat 4 years ago before this started. The Patek Philippe was on his wrist. A glass of something very old and very good was in his hand. His phone lay face up on the table. The screen showed a private account balance. The number had 8 figures and a small, untraceable history. Hartwell had stolen his algorithm. A $4.2 billion empire, built on stolen mathematics. Marcus had taken back what was his. And then, with the remaining breath of everything he'd built and burned and rebuilt in secret, he had taken a little extra. Not justice. Not revenge. Interest. He raised his glass to the city. The city, as always, did not look back. The clock turned midnight. He smiled.